Welcome to Engineering with Mike. Today we're going to talk about fastener and bolt strength ratings. Exciting stuff. Look at anything with a screw or bolt today and you'll see a bunch of different types. And on top of each one of them there's a little marking that tells you a little something about what it's good for and what it's not good for. These markings mean something important. And I learned the hard way that you can't trust everything you see. And if you use the wrong bolt, you're going to have problems. So let's take a quick look at this 2023 BMW S1000 RR package. Some of the bolts here are certain strength ratings and some are other strength ratings. And if we look very closely here, for instance, it only supports the tail section and it's not part of the suspension. It's not really structural other than holding the passenger or pillion and rider up, but important to some degree. And it looks like it's rated with an 8.8 metric rating. I'll get back to what that means in a second. Let's look at some of these other bolts here. These tiny ones here, and these other ones that are used on the engine cover. They're not structural, but important. And they hold smaller parts together that are, if they failed, would not be catastrophic. These have what appears to be an A2 rating. Oh, that's interesting. Now, if we go over here to something like an engine mount bolt, it's currently covered up with this thing called a frame slider. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second, but the factory engine mount bolt, it's a 10 millimeter by 1.5 millimeter pitch metric bolt. It is 10.9 rated. So 10 is higher than 8.8, and I'll tell you what that means in a second. Down here, we've got a brake caliper bolt. Now this, I would think, is quite important. You don't want this to fail because your brake caliper is going to go flying off when you use the brake. This bolt, I for sure thought it would be rated at 10.9, but it's actually 8.8. Interesting. If I recall from a Japanese car I had several years ago, it had 10.9 bolts on its brake calipers, and pretty much everywhere else too. Germans like to complicate things, so on this motorcycle there's like at least 3 different grades of bolts. On the Japanese car, everything was 10.9 rated. So what does this all mean? Well, here's a table and what these numbers mean. So far we saw today at the bottom end A2. Higher up we had 8.8, and higher than that we had 10.9 for the engine mount, which I would think is the very stressed member, subject to lots of vibration and torquing back and forth. So my funny story starts with these lovely thing called frame sliders. They replace, or they mount to where the engine mount bolt is. And I got these wonderful frame sliders. They protect the body of the motorcycle if you ever drop the bike or scrape it on the ground. But it came with, and truth be told, these were purchased online from a Far East Asian country at a very good price. And the hardware that they shipped with are designed to go into the same holes as the stock engine mount bolt. However, they were rated at 12.9, which is an incredibly high rating for this bolt, even higher than the stock 10.9. And well, it turns out that they weren't actually 12.9. Big surprise. These bolts, in a matter of weeks, sheared in two. They literally broke in two just from the vibration. No impacts, nothing hit them. They just broke in two. So not only were they not truly 12.9 rated, they weren't even 10.9. They weren't even 8.8. They weren't even A2. They were about as useful as a wooden dowel. They were complete garbage. So what I did was replace them with A2 bolts. Now A2s are weaker than the 10.9 hardware that came with the motorcycle. But is that a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. When we're talking about bolt selection, bolt strength selection, If the bolt fails, this is not a critical failure. I can just replace it, no big deal. One of the engine mounts is a little loose, big deal. It's not like a wheel's gonna fall off or something. And on top of that, if I ever drop the bike and a lot of lateral force is put on that frame slider, I don't wanna mess up the engine block, I don't wanna mess up the frame. I'd rather the bolt yield and bend than it stays strong and damage threads, damage frames, whatever. So I'd rather the bolt yield first. And this is the trick with bolt selection and the strength ratings. You want to pick something that's strong enough, but also not too strong for your application. You'll notice, as we saw before, that all the hardware on this bike, a lot of the retaining screws, the trim screws and all that, the caps, the covers, the screws that mount the covers on the engine, they are A2 rated. So that is a notably weaker strength bolt. However, highly corrosion resistant. So that's the thing. When you get to the weaker bolts, they typically have better corrosion resistance, assuming you've selected the right material, in other words, stainless steel. When you get into the higher strength bolts, you tend to sacrifice some corrosion resistance. And on a vehicle, corrosion resistance, especially low down where salt spray, moisture, and everything hits it, it's very important to have corrosion resistance, because the bike doesn't just have to, and car and bicycle and whatever, doesn't just have to survive the forces exerted on it today. It has to be capable of sustaining those forces 10 years, 20 years in the future without it corroding apart and falling apart. So, that's a major criterion for nut and bolt selection. So what did we learn today? Well, we know that there are important decisions to be made when you pick the kind of bolts you use. You don't want them too strong, but you certainly don't want them too weak. Corrosion resistance is important, and it really helps to understand your application really well. Remember, we're not just trying to make it survive near term, but it has to survive long term as well. That means corrosion, that means vibration, fatigue, things like that. And a lot of engineering work has gone into every single nut and bolt, especially on this German motorcycle where, like I said, Germans love to overcomplicate things. My past experience with other vehicles from other countries that are very well engineered, but they went simple. They went with a very limited number of bolt sizes, and they also went with standard grades right across the board, 10.9, which is a highly rated grade that's pretty much good for everything. Let's take a look at some other bolts. Oh my God, have you ever seen so many leaves in an engine bay? All right, let's zoom in here. What do we got? Where's that? So that looks like an 8.8. So a non-critical application, grade 8 bolt. Sorry, 8.8 bolt. Metric uses 8.8, not grade 8. Similarly, we got some chassis reinforcement. That's another 8.8. Let's see what mysteries this Tesla has. A lot of junk in here. I don't see any bolts. What should we do? Let's rip all this shit apart. Need bolts. Looking for bolts. Need bolts. Here, look, what's this? I can't read that. It's illegible. Oh, no, there we go. Those are 8.8. Interesting. Thanks for watching, everybody. Like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.